the same speech, which people had forgotten about, that perhaps there is a clue to this enigma, which is the national interest. And again, I think scholars of international relations and practical, diplomats and practical-minded business people, they all ask this question: what is the national interest of China? And of course, the national interest of China keeps changing, as the national interest of any nation state really does over time. So I am not going to offer the final word, but I think in talking with Chinese people in various walks of life and reading sources and judging the situation, it seems that China, above all, since the end of Cultural Revolution and beginning of reform in 1978, really has been interested in two things. One is political stability. The other is economic growth and technological modernization.
Yes, I would agree with that. Certainly in terms of its foreign policy, I fully agree that the emphasis has been on internal stability. So when it pursues its foreign policy agenda, it keeps that first and foremost in mind. And second, it wants to, of course, continue its economic development. But I would probably add perhaps one more thing, and that is it needs to maintain, if you will, a harmonious, if you will, arrangement in Asia. China abuts, as you know, many countries around it, and it needs to try to maintain a good relationship with these countries, some of whom China shares a rather long border, 600-mile border. And so internal stability, but clearly needs to have a good relationship with, say, Russia.
How has China's relationship been with its neighbors over the past, say, 50 years or so?
Well, the last 50 years has been, shall we say, problematic. For one thing, the Chinese have engaged in wars in some of the border areas. The Chinese, as you know, fought on the side of the North Koreans against the United States in Korea. It has fought against what was then the Soviet Union over border disputes. The Chinese feel that the Tsarist Empire had basically stolen a large part of China's territory. And hence there are conflicts over where the border lies. It has fought a war with India over strategic roads. It has fought a war with Vietnam. It's almost axiomatic that you encroach on China's borders, they react very, very badly, and they will fight.
Actually, there is something very interesting in this history of say, post-1949 China and its foreign policy. One of my former colleagues, Professor Peter Van Ness, did some very interesting work on Chinese foreign policy in the 60s. He asked the question whether Chinese foreign policy was really revolutionary. And his answer was largely no, that it was largely nationalistic. In other words,
what does that mean?
Revolutionary foreign policy would be that you really try to promote or help revolution in other countries rather than try to deal with what at that time in that language would have been called the ruling classes of those countries. Indian ruling class, for example, was basically, according to this way of looking at it, a capitalist class, ruling class. And China theoretically was ruled by the working class during this time. But actually, during the 50s, China and India had very close relationship, and it was somewhat of a surprise, in fact, a great shock to Nehru, that China and India ended up in a war. It turns out that Nehru was misinformed by his own advisors, and by and large, probably the Indian side was more to blame for this particular border skirmish. It's really probably misleading to call this a war than the Chinese side. But be that as it may, I think Peter Van Ness's main thesis that Chinese foreign policy, including this history of skirmishes and wars, border wars, really reflect more nationalism than proletarian internationalism during this period. And China, of course, has abandoned that completely right now. So we can expect it to be even more guided by whatever the perceived national interest of China happens to be.
Yes, I would agree with that. Actually, familiar with Van Ness's work and his point that China wasn't really into exporting revolution, as many of our own people thought. You have to remember this was in the context of the Cold War. And in the context of the Cold War, we were looking for enemies, if for no other reason, to justify our policy of containment of not just the Soviet Union, but also of China as well. And nationalism has been used by the Chinese, whether they're nationalist Chinese or communist Chinese, with fair regularity, and it's true today as well. And they use nationalism, some people say, to divert people's attention from some of their internal difficulties. The current, well, if you will, conflict, I guess I can use that term, conflict with Japan is an example of that. They have, raised issues with the Japanese about their, about their forgetting of history, certainly recent history. And that has created a nationalist furor in the country. And it unifies the people.
Right.
It unifies them.
So it's not so different from the United States or other countries that are extremely nationalistic. We have this pride about ourselves that makes us very combative against anyone who seems like a threat to us. Kind of back on the economic front, though, is China one of the countries that is buying a lot of U.S. bonds and helping to keep our debt afloat?
Our treasury bonds, to be more exact. Japan, of course, is the largest buyer, and China is now second, and followed by Taiwan and Korea. Of course, partly it is because the Chinese central bankers especially thought that U.S. assets like treasury bonds would maintain their value, and dollar would not depreciate too quickly. But of course, dollar has been depreciating. It's partly a problem for the Chinese as well. And quietly, the private holders of dollar-denominated assets already have been reallocating for a number of years, assets away from dollar-denominated assets to non-dollar-denominated hard currency assets like euro or yen even. But Chinese officials have not been so active, but recently there are signs that they too are thinking of and are indeed moving some of the assets from dollar-denominated ones, for example, to euro-denominated assets. But it's not that quick or that
Right.
large an amount.
Now, what are the implications of that? If China, as this emerging power, holds a lot of the U.S.'s debt, and what opportunities or problems can present itself there, and then B, if China does start to say, well, the dollar is losing value, instead of investing in U.S. Treasury bonds, we're going to start investing in the euro because it's a more stable monetary unit at the moment. What are the implications for the United States if either of those things starts to happen?
Well, first of all, I think we have to realize that we consume beyond our means. We run persistent balance of trade deficit, which means that we have all these wonderful goods, many of which are made in China, to consume at a very low price. Walmart wouldn't be Walmart without all those goods made in China. But if people stop financing it by buying our assets, basically, and lending us basically credit, they're sending a lot of the goods on credit as well, then we would have to stop consuming those things. And we'd have to follow the advice that we have been giving all those less developed countries, But since we are, a wealthy country with a lot of credit, I don't think that is about to happen. And I don't think there will be a kind of drastic change. People are not going to dramatically and overnight shift all the official assets in the central bank portfolio to euros. So people who come up with alarmist scenarios are wrong. On the other hand, we do have a problem in the medium to long run, and we have to think about how to live within our means, basically.
Yes, that will probably be the great American challenge in the 21st century, living within our means.
You wouldn't think that it would be, but it certainly could be. Again, we're talking about China and kind of where China is headed and what China is becoming. is, and obviously a lot of businesses look at China as, hey, this is this great trading partner. There are a lot of people in China that we want to sell our products from. There are a lot of people in China to do labor that Walmart can get products made very cheaply. But how long before China kind of moves from this, its position now as a lot of revenue but kind of low per capita, to kind of having a large middle class that has wealth per capita on par with, say, a Europe or Japan or the United States?
I think that's rather difficult to predict, even for economists, don't you think?
Oh yes, well, prediction is always very, very hazardous, and a lot of things can happen, especially for China, because along with this story of rapid success in terms of growth, there has been polarization. Chinese inequality index, commonly measured by Gini index, for example, has gone from below 0.3 to above 0.5. There is polarization between the coastal areas and the hinterlands. Conflicts have risen, and the number of those incidents has increased. But the current regime, led by Hu Jintao, recognizes those problems.
Yes.
They actually have made it a priority to do something about that. But whether they will be able to, build this harmonious society is not a question that can be easily answered. So I would agree. On the other hand, if the present trends continue, certainly China will become the leading economy and leading power in Asia. And Asians and others will have to contend with China. And it would be in everybody's interest, actually, to have a rich China rather than a poor and divided China.
Yes, well, certainly they've shown that, right? Because the Japanese economy received a lift, from the success of the Chinese economy. We had hoped that the Japanese themselves would be able to solve their own problems and be the leader in lifting the rest of Asia. And it turns out they've had to defer to the Chinese on this. It seems to me that the kind of economic growth that we've been talking about has led to a number of problems, including one with an emerging middle class. For one thing, the middle class in China will, like the middle class elsewhere, want more political power that is commensurate with their economic power. And in more practical terms, they will demand things that the Chinese at the moment don't have, such as having a well-articulated set of property laws. And the very notion of laws themselves is an important one that the Chinese leadership have to grapple with. Because at the moment, China really is a nation of men rather than a nation of laws. And that makes it problematic in the world.
Right. Let me just add an optimistic note here, because in the National People's Congress, there is a standing committee, and there are indications that people are talking seriously about this. But I think the problematic part is that when people talk about it, usually they're talking it in terms of, again, building economic growth and prosperity, and more along the lines of commercial laws and honoring contracts, and forgetting that the majority of Chinese actually have their daily living problems, and their problem is to get justice when they have problems. And let me just quote something from Pearl Buck in the 30s. She had great faith in Chinese people, as we know, and she said, "Nothing and no one can destroy the Chinese people. But Chinese people are a long-suffering, but also a rebellious sort of people. And they will get justice, I know. I just hope that it is sooner rather than later."
Yes, I would agree with that. Many of the problems that China is currently experiencing in society is, in fact, at the local level, where, unfortunately, corruption is rampant. And there are injustices that are visited on the people on a daily basis. And because they don't have a well-developed system for dealing with grievances, they express it often through, public demonstrations. And they have lots of them, on a daily basis. Somewhere I think I read that they may have had as many as 74,000 74,000 last year, increasing numbers. And they're small, they're orderly, but sometimes they are also large, and a number of them have been violent.
Now, we're down to almost a little over a minute left in the show, so this might be too hard a question to answer. How much of the recent economic growth has been driven by the fact that China is still a society of men rather than of laws, and has it allowed for there to be streamlined things where maybe in a democracy things couldn't have happened as quickly?
Actually, I'd say that at the local level, I saw a lot of democracy in China, in Shenyang and surrounding areas. In an automobile plant, there was a lot of discussion about economics, but it's clearly top-driven economic growth so far, and it has succeeded because it's a certain kind of extensive growth.
Okay, and unfortunately, we have to end there. But thank you very much, William and Haider. You're both very intelligent men and educational about China. Thank all of you for tuning in to watch us. Next week, we're going to talk about the impact of the Iraqi war on reservists, particularly. But there are a lot of people who have been sent over to Iraq, and they have left their jobs, they've left their families, and they thought they were going to be there for 6 months or a year, and it turns out that they're being put on consecutive tours where 18 months, 2 years. And so we're going to talk about what the impact has been on reservists. Thank you. Good night. Good evening and welcome to Global Agenda, the show that brings world issues to your doorstep. I'm your host, Reggie Rivers. Tonight we'll get an update on NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Its supporters promised that it would create jobs, raise living standards in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and improve environmental conditions. Its critics argued that it would destroy U.S. jobs, undermine democratic control of domestic policy making, and threaten health, environmental, and food safety standards. Tonight, we'll try to figure out what impact NAFTA has had during the past 12 years. Please welcome Haider Khan, a professor of international economics at the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's also a visiting fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo, and he's a special advisor to the United Nations for the Millennium Development Goals. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you. Well, in trying to understand NAFTA and what's been going on with NAFTA over the past decade, or 12 years now, I think it's most important to start off with North American Free Trade Agreement. That's 5 words, none of which includes treaty. And I think that most people think of it as a treaty, but it's not.
That's a very good question, actually. We have a very special definition of treaty in this country, which most people probably do not know. Without going into technicalities too much, let me just say that NAFTA actually is technically defined as a congressional executive agreement. And the difference between that kind of an agreement and treaty, according to our law, is that